Welcome to Aspen Leading Edge. I'm Patty Roberts from St. Mary's University School of Law, and today's guests are a trio of former housing litigators, all professors now. They include Florence Roisman, and she is the William F. Harvey Professor of Law at Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law. Also, Stacy Seicshnaydre, who's the William K. Christovich Professor of Law and Robert A. Ainsworth Professor in the Courts and the Federal System at Tulane Law School. And finally, Rigel Oliveri, who is the Isabella Wade and Paul C. Lita Professor of Law at the University of Missouri School of Law. So thanks to all of you for joining me today.
Thank you, Patricia.
Well, I'm excited to talk about your new book. Aspen is publishing in February, I understand, The Right to Fair Housing, Cases, Statutes, and Context. The three of you have co-authored. It's a first edition, and why don't we start by talking a little bit about what our readers and listeners can expect to find in this new book.
Could we say one thing? It is the first and, for the moment, only fair housing case book in the United States.
Well, that's outstanding.
There isn't another one.
And what is the vision for use of this book? Is this a book where would you use this book in the law school curriculum?
Well, I think this is Rigel. All of our motivations behind doing this book was that we were teaching a fair housing course without a book for years now. And we were assembling our materials and trying to put them together and in the old days make packets. And I think all of us independently came to the conclusion that we needed to have a book. And so the first point of use for this book would be for classroom teachers who want to teach a class in fair housing law. We believe there are many out there who might have wanted to teach this but just didn't because of a lack of the book. There are others who have been doing it like us without a book for a long time. So I think that was the first point of use would be for a traditional classroom law school course in fair housing law.
Well, it seems stunning to me that it's the first one. I mean, this is such an important area of the law and has become increasingly necessary and discussed in law school curricula. So thank you for starting us off with the first book on the right to fair housing. How did the three of you find each other to become co-authors?
Well, interestingly, we had known and respected one another just from interactions over the years. Florence and I, this is Stacy, have served on the board of the Inclusive Communities Project, which is a Dallas-based civil rights and fair housing organization. Rigel worked with the Justice Department before she became a professor. And so, all of us have traveled in similar circles and knew each other, that each of us had a housing and a fair housing litigation background and just sort of intersected in different ways. And then when we joined the academy, we also, because we were all teaching fair housing, got to know one another and just, fortunately, all at about the same time, decided that we wanted to do something about the fact that there was no fair housing book for us to teach from.
I wanted to add one thing, and that is that we think this book also will be very useful to clinicians. Stacy has supervised a fair housing clinic. All of us have litigated in our ill-spent youth, and we very much had in mind that people who were supervising people in a clinical setting would use this book also.
Another thing to mention is, Rigel has taught Title VII. There are many, many books and many courses on employment discrimination. And as you mentioned, this is despite the importance of housing and development. Everyone is affected by fair housing. Everyone's affected by the way our neighborhoods have been developed historically and the way they look today. Fair housing touches everything. It touches access to every single kind of opportunity that exists. It affects health, public health. It affects the environment. It affects access to education. It affects access to employment. And so it's so pivotal and central, and yet it has been kind of a neglected subject matter. And in fact, when I first proposed a course in fair housing, the question that I got from the committee reviewing the proposal was, will there be enough material to fill a semester? And so we laugh about that now because we've got material that we can hardly cover in a semester. And there is going to be some opportunity for people who use the book to decide what topics really work best for them and for their purposes. But Just to give an example, we cover federal practice topics, so like practice-oriented topics, the law of standing, constitutional issues around standing, pleading requirements, discovery, summary judgment. So there's some heavy federal practice issues there that span across many fields. There's administrative law. Florence teaches administrative law, and so there's an opportunity to talk about regulations that are issued by HUD, which is the agency that's tasked or authorized to interpret the fair housing law. And so there's a lot of issues there to talk about with students. There's, real estate, appraisal, financing, access to credit. There's disability rights. There's sexual harassment. There's immigration and national origin. There's family status. There's sexual orientation and gender identity that are now interpreted to be covered by sex prohibitions against sex discrimination, zoning. There's so many different things that our book touches. And the thing that I've really loved about working with these co-authors is that everyone brings a slightly different lens. As I mentioned, Florence teaches administrative law. She also teaches property law. She's also steeped and the most well-read historian I've ever met, and has a huge library that she's drawn on of historical material so that we can ground our discussion in history. Rigel worked for the Justice Department, has enforced fair housing from a government enforcement perspective, and teaches con law and teaches Title VII. So those are two really heavy subjects that really help inform her perspective on fair housing. I come more from a civil procedure background. So we're all, kind of bringing something slightly different to the book, but it's made it such a rewarding and enjoyable experience to work on this project with these wonderful women.
Sounds like you're the perfect team to handle this topic together. But boy, Stacy, when you were rattling off all the issues that are impacted in areas of law that are impacted by fair housing, I could certainly see how this would be difficult to cover in a semester, let alone a year. Florence, if you could ground us a little bit in the history of fair housing for our general audience, where have we come the last 100 years as a society with fair housing?
We've come quite a distance. We have 18 chapters in the book, and the first 2 chapters are historical. The rest of the book takes off after 1968. 2 big things happened in 1968 from a housing point of view, from a fair housing point of view. One is that Congress passed the first version of the Fair Housing Act, and the other is that the Supreme Court in 1968 decided Jones versus Mayer, in which the court held that the 1866 Civil Rights Act barred private acts of discrimination, and that Congress was authorized to do that by the 13th Amendment. So 1968 liberated a lot of fair housing law. The second chapter of our book is really about the 1866 statute, the Jones versus Mayer decision, and some decisions after Jones versus Mayer interpreting the Reconstruction era statute. The first chapter of our book, which is about 100 pages long, takes us from the end of the Civil War through Reconstruction, through the period of redemption, which of course was redemption of the Confederacy, into really the middle of the 20th century, and then to, ultimately 1968. But it's really the Second World War when things started to happen significantly. So in that first chapter, we deal with racial zoning, we deal with racial covenants, we deal with the New Deal programs, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, public housing, and the FHA program. We deal with the World War II programs, the VA program, and then the Urban Renewal Program and the Interstate Highway Program. And we show how those programs built the United States as we know it today, as a pervasively racially and economically segregated country. Not everybody will teach all of that. I hope we'll teach some of that, but I know when I'm teaching it, it'll take the first month of the course to get us to 1968. And then we'll do the FHA and then take off from there.
Thank you. And Rigel, you were with the Department of Justice and so involved more in enforcement of some of the laws that have developed through the history that Florence briefly covered. How has that enforcement changed, and where would you say we are today with our enforcement nationally for fair housing?
It's tricky. The Department of Justice is probably the most high-profile enforcer of the law, but they actually enforce vanishingly small percentage of the actual cases, just given the way they're structured. So much of the enforcement is done by private fair housing organizations that may receive government funding but sort of operate as their own entities. And that's been a really important source of enforcement. Government has a role to play, and that role will fluctuate and vary by administration. I was there during 2 different administrations, so I could see how priorities can shift. But yeah, I think probably the most important avenue for the Fair Housing Act to be enforced is through private entities that have the resources to investigate and do outreach and work on behalf of clients. Historically, that's been who's done the majority of the heavy lifting there.
I just wanted to add one thing, which is that there are statutory attorney's fees under Title 8, under the Fair Housing Act. And it's a wonderful field for students to go into. I mean, people want to make a living. If you want to do good and do well at the same time, fair housing is a terrific area for people to go into.
That's an excellent point.
That now that there's a book, more people will teach this material and get more students doing this work.
I'll say one of the things that I often emphasize with my students when I teach this material is here are places that you can do this work, because there's government, obviously state and federal governments have various offices that will do this kind of enforcement. There's the private or the fair housing agencies, because I think a lot of people just don't know that this work goes on. We're all familiar with maybe employment discrimination in the HR department and the litigation that can come when there's disputes in that area. But I don't think a lot of people would know right at this moment, what should you do if you have a potential housing discrimination complaint? Where would you go? And then who would be working on it? So, I think it's important for everybody to know the answers to those questions, but particularly students who just may not have ever been exposed to this line of work and the breadth really that you can practice in.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I've had students go work for firms that are advising lenders on how to remain in compliance with a whole host of regulatory obligations. Students who are interested in real estate who help advise on real estate deals that are perhaps including government sources of financing. So like we said earlier, there's fair housing touches so many different sectors that students and lawyers are touching so many different sectors. And so where there is some kind of transaction or some kind of compliance issue, there are lawyers. And so our students can become more sophisticated about how fair housing informs some of those sectors. And so I think our course really can be a useful tool to help students think of pathways, career pathways that they may not have otherwise considered.
Yeah, I'd also just throw in there sort of state and local government or even municipal government. A lot of my students stick around Columbia and work in various government offices, and there's zoning, planning, development, all sorts of things like that I know they appreciate having this background in.
Well, excellent suggestions. I know that the students or potential students out there will be interested in hearing about the possibility of doing this work. Now, Stacy, one thing that I thought was interesting in your bio is that Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy cited your work in the landmark disparate impact case of Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus the Inclusive Communities Project. One, I'd love to know about what of your work was cited, but second, as a Texan, I'd love to know about this disparate impact case.
Wow. Well, that case, it's a hard case to teach because it's a very complex case and it involves tax credit housing. So that's a type of government subsidized housing. It's like the largest source of housing production right now in the United States. And this organization, Inclusive Communities Project, sued the state or sued the department that oversaw the tax credit program because of the way that the state was funding that housing production, which is an opportunity to provide more affordability in the housing market because of the location of the housing. So in other words, what is the government, when it has this opportunity to subsidize housing, are they doing so in a way that helps reverse longstanding patterns of segregation, or are they just doubling down on existing segregation? And so that was the nature of the lawsuit. and I'm oversimplifying it. But one of their arguments was that there were some neutral criteria that weren't necessarily facially discriminatory, but neutral criteria that were being used in a way that had an effect of perpetuating segregation and of disparately impacting housing opportunities. And so that theory, disparate impact, has been a contested theory across the civil rights landscape. Fair housing is no exception. And so the study I did looked at the history of the way that disparate impact was used in housing cases and demonstrated that the sky wasn't falling. It wasn't wreaking havoc. It was essentially most successful in sort of exclusionary zoning cases where communities were deciding not to allow production of housing that was likely to be used by people of color, and that this theory was able to be used to ensure that the location and the development of housing was being done on an equitable basis and not in a way that denied opportunity to people who have historically been disadvantaged in the housing market. And so I just did a study on sort of historical use of the theory, the fact the sky wasn't falling. It was a very difficult theory. It was not particularly successful. And so I think that Justice Kennedy cited it to sort of make the point of, we're going to allow this theory, we're going to uphold the use of disparate impact under the Fair Housing Act. That was not a holding that a lot of people expected, but Kennedy upheld use of the theory and cited many different sources, but that was one of the sources he cited. I think one of the reasons was because the study showed that it was a modest theory, that it was not going to upend the housing market.
Terrific. And you mentioned, or one of the parties in there was the Inclusive Community Project, and I understand all three of you have been involved with the Inclusive Community Project. Oh, no, two of you. Okay. Stacy and Florence, what does the Inclusive Community Project do? Florence?
It was a leading edge advocacy organization for really requiring, mostly through litigation, HUD to adapt many of its policies so as to make those policies more inclusive. It really created a program of using small area fair market rent levels so that people who were getting housing assistance could get housing assistance in relatively more expensive and relatively more integrated communities. A very dramatic impact, which came exclusively from activities that were pursued by ICP. And the challenge to how sites for the low-income housing tax credit program were chosen in Texas, which is what the case Stacy was talking about involved, that was all driven by the litigation that ICP brought. And there were a dozen other very significant leading-edge lawsuits that were brought by ICP over a period of several years. Absolutely bulldog, persevering, brilliant, do not let this out of your teeth lawyering. Just absolutely brilliant lawyering. We were both on the board. Stacy, well, we both were officers, actually. Stacy was a more effective officer than I was, but we were on the board for a long time and very supportive of the litigators and the staff there.
Stacy?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, that illustrates how there's a lot of breadth to the book, but then that you can choose certain chapters that are of particular interest and go deep, right? So we're sort of exploring the idea with Aspen, and I think they've made clear that this is possible, that if somebody wanted to teach a narrower set of chapters, because those were the issues that were most important or relevant. So if government subsidized housing, for example, was something that somebody wanted to really delve deeply into, then we have chapters available in which individuals could do that. Somebody just wanted to focus on disability rights, for example. If somebody wanted to focus on some of the real estate financing issues and kind of put together a smaller set of issues or topics that maybe someone wanted to teach a 2-credit course as opposed to a 3-credit course. So there are lots of different ways to use the book to kind of curate something that would work for a variety of interests and backgrounds of a faculty member and of potential interest to students.
Now, I would add to that I teach the basic first-year property course, a 4-credit course, which is what most people teach now. And I'm going to use some of those chapters in my property course because I think almost all of us who teach property teach some fair housing in property, and most case books have some fair housing material, but it's often out of date and it's not very exciting. And I think we have a lot more exciting fair housing material. So I think somebody who's teaching property could use 2 or 3 chapters from the fair housing book in a property course very effectively.
So if I'm a professor considering adopting the Right to Fair Housing Cases, Statutes, and Context book that you have coming out with Aspen, what is it I would find most valuable as the professor embarking on perhaps teaching the course for the first time or having all the materials in one place if I'm teaching it for the 5th time?
I think one of the things that I'm really proud of about our book is sort of what Stacy and Florence have also been reflecting on is just the sheer breadth of coverage. We could have just gone and said, let's just look at the statute and, only do a kind of statutory interpretation and coverage and things like that. We could have focused more on the history. We could have focused more on current topics, but we decided to do it all. We were constantly worried we were going to bump up against the page limit that we were given by the publisher because we just kept finding more things that we felt were important to include. So I think any professor approaching this material can feel pretty confident that just about anything that should be talked about in the context of fair housing is going to be in there.
And what sorts of exercises have you included or teacher's manual or resources available for faculty?
Well, that is really our next phase. We have the benefit of having taught this for many, many years. And so we have a good bit of material that we can share already. And I think we'll just be expanding on that. And so, as Rigel mentioned, we did really try to cover the waterfront. There's always something new that's coming out. The use of algorithms, for example, and providing credit. There's just, there's always new material. There's always a current event. And so we will be looking at how we can keep the teacher's manual and the website, the course website up to date and kind of create a space where we can continue to provide up-to-date material as we're teaching the class we encounter, and also just there's so much material out there in terms of video content, in terms of journalistic content, law review, journalistic content. There's just so much out there. And I guess from my perspective, I've seen an explosion of material in this area compared to when I first started teaching. I think there's more and more coverage of these issues in the media. I think there's more and more coverage in just like dramatization of some of these issues. So there's a lot to work with, and we will be providing that alongside the textbook.
I think one thing we all agree on a lot, and one thing I think we all agree on is we're very proud of the fact that one of the readers Aspen secured for the book is Bob Schwen, who has since retired from Kentucky, but litigated several of the major fair housing cases and is the author of the treatise on housing discrimination. I mean, that's Schwem's book is the book, and he has been very generous in his approbation of our book. We've certainly relied on his treatise and on him, his law review articles a lot, and I know that we're all very proud of the fact that Bob thinks this is a useful book. And we were all very pleased also because one of the people with whom we worked at Aspen said early on when we first started, she said, this book matters, which is something we all think is the case. And we were very pleased about that.
Absolutely. Well, again, congratulations on the upcoming first edition of the Right to Fair Housing Cases, Statutes, and Context. Before we leave the topic of fair housing, I just out of curiosity want to ask each of you what you think is the most significant obstacle in current times to fair housing. Just a brief response from each of you.
I think I'll just jump in one of the most significant things that comes up when we teach and whenever I research and everything is economics and housing affordability. When there's just not enough of the pie to go around, or at least not the way we've structured our housing market, that exacerbates existing inequalities and makes it even that much harder for historically marginalized groups of people who have historically lacked access to good housing, good credit, and all of those things. Makes it even harder for them to make any gains and actually sets them back.
Sure, the social mobility is certainly impacted when you don't have safe and fair housing that then impacts schools and job opportunities and healthcare access.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to know. If I could just also add, I am a commissioner of our housing authority here in Columbia, and I finish my class by taking the students on a field trip to visit the housing authority, look at public housing units, talk to residents if they're around, review some of the programs that we offer, because that kind of ties up a lot of the loose ends of the things that we've been talking about in terms of access, areas of opportunity, things like that. And so that seems to be, that kind of brings it back full circle in some ways to, even though it's affordable housing that we do at the housing authority, there's always fair housing is always part of it, and vice versa. I think fair housing almost always has to think about affordable housing as well.
Oh, I bet your students just learned so much from that visit, that trip. We should all be required to have such a trip. Well, before we conclude, I wanted to ask each of you to make your predictions about the future of legal education in the coming decade. Who would like to start?
I will chime in as a professor of first-year students, teach civil procedure, as I mentioned. And I think that this notion that we give one exam at the end of the semester in the first-year classroom, that practice has persisted, at least in the first year. I think that is extremely detrimental to students. And I have to think that we are going to, just like we've done in the upper level courses, move away from that single assessment in the first year courses. I think that we need to give students more feedback. We give them some more than we used to, but not enough.
Completely agree. Florence, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I totally agree with what Stacy just said. I give a series, I give quizzes, I give papers, and I have also given an exam that counted for something, but I don't think I'm going to give an exam even in my first year class. I mean, I may be required to give it for some credit in my first year class. I think that one exam at the end, that's just stupid. It is stupid, and I don't do it now, and I'm not going to keep doing it. No,
I'm sure your students will appreciate that.
Yeah, I also think with the next gen bar exam that's coming, it's pretty clear that there's going to be more of an emphasis on taking doctrinal knowledge and applying it using practical skills to actually do the sorts of things that lawyers actually do, which isn't usually sit down in 3 hours and take a closed book exam. So, more drafting documents, things like that are going to actually be useful to people to integrate their knowledge to practice.
And I think bringing it back to how we teach fair housing, we use multiple assessments. Each of us does it slightly differently, but some of us use quizzes. I use a midterm and some shorter writing reflections. I have a final sort of shorter paper. We all kind of have incorporated a lot of different types of assessments. And of course, we'll share that, all of those ideas with whoever would like to adopt the book.
Outstanding. Well, again, congratulations, Professor Roisman, Professor Seicshnaydre, and Professor Oliveri for your Right to Fair Housing book by Aspen that will be coming out in February 2025. And I encourage our listeners to get in touch with each of these authors to learn more about the book and the topic area.
Thank
if you've
you
enjoyed
very
this,
much.
Oh, you're very welcome. If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope that you will listen to additional conversations with thought leaders from the Legal Academy on whatever channel you get your favorite podcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.